I think you all know that this is the first in what will be a series of lectures, all of which, one way or another, try to deal with questions of private contributions to public benefit. And by private, we don't just mean private capital, okay? And by public benefit, we mean anything that makes the world a better place. And we wanted to start tonight by talking a bit about social entrepreneurship, and very specifically, trying to give some sense of how to be a social entrepreneur. And just before we start, and before I do some of the housekeeping, I just want a very quick sense from those of you in the room what you think you might be. Who in the room thinks they're an entrepreneur? Okay, smallish minority. Who would like to be an entrepreneur but doesn't yet know that they have it in them or what it is? That's a slightly bigger number. Who thinks of themselves as a social entrepreneur? By the way, anyone who had their hand up first time should also have their hand up second time. I'll explain why. Okay. So I hope to bring many, many more of you into that last category, okay, which is social entrepreneurship. I hope to persuade you that it's a necessary thing for us all to be, and I hope to persuade you that it's not a mystical thing. Okay? It's not a thing you're either born or not. It's not a thing you need to be rich to do. It's not a thing you need to be tall to do. It's not a thing you need a beard to do. It's none of those things. Okay? It's a way of thinking about the world. And since I know we have some latecomers, I'm going to slightly change the order of events this evening, because as you probably know from the program, you're going to hear from me for a little while about how to be a social entrepreneur, and then I'm going to introduce a real social entrepreneur, although he often disagrees with me about whether he is one of those or not. And I'm going to start, while people are making their way from class, by showing you a 7-minute film made 10 years ago by and about the person you're going to hear from tonight. And then later, when I introduce him properly, he's going to tell you what's happened in the 10 years since this film was made. So you can settle down for the first, I think, 8 minutes of this to watch a film which is coming up now.
Over the last 50 years, there's been a 5-fold increase in the amount of fish being taken out of the oceans. A quarter of total fisheries are now classified as overfished or depleted, and another half of the remaining global fisheries are being fished as hard as they can be. Overfishing and its associated environmental impact is our second biggest sustainability challenge after climate change. We live in a world that wants more and more seafood. 1 billion people on this planet depend on seafood for their sole or their main source of protein. So many fish are being taken out that it's not leaving enough fish in the oceans to ensure that there are fish supplies for this and future generations.
The world's fishers are in trouble, and I'm worried about it personally because the sustainability of the world's stocks leads directly to the sustainability of our business and the sustainability of our employment. And of course the Grand Banks of Canada is the horror story that should be the lesson to us all about how a fishery can collapse.
In the early 90s, the Grand Banks cod fishery collapsed. This was a very large cod fishery that had been landing hundreds of thousands of tons of cod for a number of centuries. Those fish have never come back. And in addition, 40,000 fishermen lost their livelihoods. And this was a wake-up call to the industry, and that spurred the development of the Marine Stewardship Council. The MSC concept is actually quite simple. When consumers see that MSC blue eco-label, they've got that third-party assurance and verification that by choosing that product, they are not contributing to the social and environmental problems of overfishing.
Well, Hastings is a very old fishing industry. It's probably the oldest in the country. My family was here in the 1200s, and it does show you that we're a sustainable fishery, as we've been here for so many generations. But that wasn't enough. We can't prove we're a sustainable fishery. The only way we can prove we're a sustainable fishery and we have good fishery practice is to join MSC. And once you've got that badge of approval, you haven't just said you are, you've proved you are.
The MSC has a range of fisheries, from the small community-based fisheries like the Hastings fishery, Dover sole, herring and mackerel, to the mighty Alaskan fisheries like the Alaskan salmon fishery and the Alaskan pollock fishery. The key point is they've all been independently assessed as meeting the world's most rigorous scientific sustainability standard.
Our fishery is the first MSC certified tuna fishery in the world. It absolutely is going to give us an edge in the market. For the part of the public that really understands and wants something that comes from a sustainable fishery, here it is for them.
No product can carry the label in the marketplace unless every single link in the supply chain has an annual audit to make sure that they're separating certified fish from non-certified fish.
You can trace back to who caught the fish, what boat it came off of, where it was unloaded, where it was freezer stored, where it was trucked to, and how it got to you finally in the store.
We ask every supplier to go through a very, very detailed set of questionnaires. But if the fish is MSC certified, they don't have to answer any of those questions other than number one, is it MSC certified? And it's an easy, quick reassurance that that fish is sustainably sourced.
People don't really want to understand the detail, and this is where a scheme like the Marine Stewardship Council is so important, because it gives a check that they have gone through a process to ensure that they're sustainable. We also have paid more for MSC certified fish than its equivalent from non-MSC certified fisheries.
We actually in ourselves get a better price back, and that comes back to us as fishermen at the end of the day, simply because we're fishing in a good, sustainable manner. Once we've got the MSC approval, we've found new markets to avenue for our fish.
The growth over the last 2 years has been astronomical. So, for example, Walmart, the world's largest retailer, in 2006 made a commitment that within 5 years, for their wild capture fish supplies, they will only source Marine Stewardship Council certified fish.
We sell approximately 20 million pounds of fresh fish a year. We had to do something that would protect us as we grow and as we need more and more product into the future. And that's where the MSC really shone out to us as a leading way that we can really embrace and grow our business.
So the vision is to create a race to the top in global fisheries management by identifying, creating market incentives and rewarding the best managed fisheries in the world. We are now approaching a tipping point. We now have an estimated 200 million items of MSC labelled seafood being sold annually around the world in 36 countries. People are getting more of an understanding of what that funny blue logo actually means, that that product has come from a well-managed fishery.
We want children to see the blue label, the MSC logo. You have to teach the children that that's a choice that they can make that actually is good for the planet. And it's now built into the curriculum, so children as they come through will continue to learn about the difference between general fish that you can buy and the MSC label.
We're very concerned that there won't be supply going forward. Sustainability isn't just a business term of how I keep my business going, it's also the impact that we're having on the environment. And sooner or later, we feel that competition will have to go down this route because the raw material supply is dwindling and dwindling. And so the traditional, I can buy 1 million pounds from wherever I need it, 5 or 10 years from now, 15, 20 years from now, they're not going to be able to do either.
I think the last 2 years have proven that the MSC concept works. There's a business case for fisheries to come forward, and most importantly, there's an ecological case.
What's at stake at the end of the day is the future of the fishing industry in itself, because if we don't look after fish stocks for the future, there will be no fish for the future.
Seafood is the most traded primary commodity in the world. Half of that fish is coming from the developing world. For MSC to really be able to deliver its mission of contributing to reversing the decline in global fish stocks, we have to become global. And whilst we have 7% of global fisheries in the programme, in an ideal world, we need 100%. Because I think it's beholden on all of us to ensure that this valuable and renewable food resource is managed sustainably for this and future generations.
Right. I was going to show you that film between me talking and Rupert talking, but this has given the time for some people to catch us up. I'm going to talk now for 20 minutes or so about how to be a social entrepreneur. I'm going to start with a few points of housekeeping. This is a series of lectures. Okay? That series is described behind me. It ought to span a really kind of extraordinary variety of how you might try to improve the state of the world using innovation, capital, your money, other people's money, energy, connections, networks, science. That's really what we want to introduce to you over the course of the next 2 terms. You'll see here the topics that we're looking at, and we have some treats in store for you. Anyone who's got something else to do on the 23rd of January should cancel it immediately and book into handing up the power dynamics. That will be a newsworthy evening. So that is what is in store. And you get a certificate of attendance if you attend all 5 of those over the course of the next 2 terms. And that certificate of attendance ensures that you are sustainably caught. I'm going to talk to you now about how to be a social entrepreneur. And I'm going to try to navigate some of the kind of messy terminology and some of the messy thinking that sits around this topic. I'm guessing that most of you are here because you care about the state of the world. Does anyone want to say that they are indifferent to outcomes in human welfare? No. You're all here because you care about the state of the world. I'm guessing that you care enough to want to engage yourselves, your personal capital, your careers, your professional identity, your money, your energy, the rest of your 80,000 hours of productive life. And I'm guessing also that you're confused about some of the words that you see behind me. Okay? So I'm going to start by trying to do a little bit of tracing of some of this stuff. Okay, what is entrepreneurship? Okay, a couple of definitions here. Does anyone want to shout out any other definitions of entrepreneurship? Who said lonely? That's a description of what it is to be one. I completely agree. But I'm not sure that's enough of a definition because there are lots of lonely pursuits. This is what I think entrepreneurship is. Okay? And I hope that when you hear Rupert later, you'll get a kind of sense of how this is really about trying to get stuff done without owning or controlling the means to get it done. Okay? You don't already have the money. You don't already have the contracts. You don't already have the staff. You don't already have a supply chain. You probably don't already have a prototype. What you've probably got is an idea. Okay? And what you probably have is some sense of how that idea might turn into reality. But what you really have is a kind of argument, a kind of conviction about the future. Okay? And you don't own or control all the means to get that stuff done. And this is true even if you're super smart and super rich and super well connected. So start to think about entrepreneurship as the means by which you knit together a bunch of things that other people control. And start to think about yourselves as agents of that kind of resource mobilization, rather than thinking of yourselves as people who have to own and control everything. Okay? It is a fundamentally different way of thinking about things. And if you want to test in your life, if you want to test how entrepreneurial people are, ask them what they do. Okay? And if they say, I manage 15 people, or 150 people, or 15,000 people, or this division is under my control, or I have a budget of X or Y, okay, they are not entrepreneurs. If people tell you that they're trying to get something done, I want to solve this, I want to achieve that, they probably are. And whenever you think about yourselves in this frame, think about nudging yourself into that category of people who can countenance getting stuff done without owning or controlling the means. And to do that, you need a whole bunch of stuff that is often talked about in this world. You need some kind of tolerance for risk. You need to be open to other people and their abilities. You need to be very, very scrupulous about scanning the horizon for what's interesting, and so on and so on. So, what, if anything, of that is true for you, since we've agreed that you're here because you care about the state of the world, and we've agreed that you're here because you want to dedicate some chunk of your extraordinary privilege, okay? And I just want to pause there. It doesn't matter how big your debt is, okay? If you're in this room, if we're having this conversation, you are in a position to tilt the world a little bit in the direction you want it. That's an amazing privilege. Just the thought that you could is an amazing privilege. Before you get onto the fact that you're here, that you know each other, by knowing each other you know a whole ton of other people, you have access to all the extraordinary intellectual resources of this institution, and so on. Okay? So what's true of the entrepreneurship story in this more public-spirited, less shareholder-focused? And what I want to persuade you of is that where you start is something to do with the state of the world. It's something to do with what Roger Martin, whom I'm quoting there and whom I will quote elsewhere, calls a terrible equilibrium. Okay? In Rupert's case, it was the likely obliteration of the sea stocks of the world's oceans. Okay? The almost certain obliteration of that diversity, oceanic diversity, okay? And the certain impoverishment of our environment, of a key source of protein, and so on. That was a terrible equilibrium. Okay? So if you're really serious about making the step to being a social entrepreneur, putting your hands up at the end of this lecture series in 2 or 3 months' time, start by thinking about the things you like least about the state of the world. Because that's where the interesting opportunities are. And then set about doing something that is very LSE. Set about trying to understand them. What kind of terrible equilibrium? By virtue of what is the market, let's say, failing? What do we mean when we say it's unjust? Or what do we mean when we say it's unsustainable? Or what do we mean when we say we want to replace it with something else? Understand is step one. Step two is envision. Okay, this is where you're telling yourself a story in order to tell someone else a story, because these are, remember, all arguments about the future. Understand, envision, and then build. And build is what you do if you're an entrepreneur. You don't yet have a prototype. You don't yet have any people who are prepared to help you. You certainly don't have any money. Okay? You just have you have a detailed understanding about a terrible equilibrium, which you then want to build. So that is my kind of very quick sense of what it is we're talking about here. Entrepreneurship is about getting stuff done without owning or controlling the means to getting it done. Social entrepreneurship is the same thing, where it derives from, Martin calls a terrible equilibrium, what we might call some kind of injustice, what we might call a market failure if we're economically motivated, what we might call a particular pressing local question if we're acting in a place, in a time. And of course it's for you to understand that. And then I thought what I'd do next is just to talk a little bit about things to avoid, or what I take to be some very simple precepts in social entrepreneurship. And the first one you'll see, I say, it's not about the morality, okay? But it's all about the morality. So what do I think that means. Don't go into this world simply by virtue of your superior fellow feeling for humankind. That is not sufficient. Okay? And the world is full of good people doing bad deals, and good people telling other people what is good for them, okay? By virtue of being sensitive and insightful. Okay? So it's not about your morality. That is not the leading principle that will determine your success. But, okay, and paradoxically, if you don't care, if what motivates you is not the reversal of an unjust equilibrium, or the addressing of a terrible misequilibrium, or the market failure, or whatever it is, okay, you are not responding to an opportunity which you've understood. Okay? So your social return on investment, which is to say the return on your energy and activity, okay, should be greater than your own motivation. Okay? And if you find yourself reaching for the, I care so much about their children that I can do nothing but this, you need to check yourself and say, that may be true, but it's not relevant. Okay? So go back to your, it's not about the morality, okay? But it is about the morality. It's not about the business model, but it is about the business model. What does that mean? I don't care whether you are for profit or not for profit. Okay? You count as a social entrepreneur if you have investors, and you count as a social entrepreneur if you have grant funders. Okay? So I'm completely agnostic about the constitution, whether you're a community interested corporation, whether you're an NGO, whether you're a charity, whether you're a for-profit corporation. Okay? But I do care deeply about the business model, where the business model is, what are you doing, how, and how do you know whether it's working? So one way to describe what a business model is simply to ask that. Okay? Who pays you, for what? How do they know if it's working? How do you know if it's working? How do you wish to be measured? Okay? So it is about the business model, and it's not about the business model. It is definitely not about the business plan. Okay? And in your world, your first encounter with doing this stuff in real life will often be around business plans, because you will all be doing capstone projects, or you will all be doing projects, or you'll all be in a competition in which the thing is a document that says this is what we're going to do. And that thing is as good as it is robust and logical and complete. Okay? But as you know, that won't survive contact with the terrible equilibrium. It will change. So you need something that is enough to get you started and not enough to keep you tied down. And things will not go as you plan them to do. Those of you who know the Marshall Institute, those of you in Nava Ashraf's class will recognize the next precept for social entrepreneurs. Build your measurement, build experimentation, and build modesty into your core case. It's incredibly hard to go back over the last decade of work and say, right, now this looks as though it's working, let's figure out how we can articulate what we were doing when we were doing it. Or let's talk now about how to measure some of the return that is embodied in our activities. It's really hard, so build that in from the start. And what I mean by modesty is twofold. One is just a practical, tactical question. Okay? You should be sensitive to signals that what you dearly believe in is not working. Okay? Because only you know how to adjust that so that it might work better. So that's one kind of modesty, okay? Which is, don't get so close to your idea or your beautiful design or your pet project or the thing that has changed your life or the business model, okay? That you are impervious to the signals that the market or the circumstance are giving you that might not be working in the way that you wish it to. That's one kind of modesty. The other kind of modesty, which is a bit more profound, is be very, very, very sensitive to this question about who you speak for, who you speak through, and who you speak with. Okay? If you're an entrepreneur and you have investors, particularly if they're professional investors, it's pretty easy. You know on whose behalf you're doing what you're doing. You're doing it for the share price. Let's just say that's a simple proxy. Okay? If you're doing it to address a fundamental failure in the market, if you're doing it to address some fundamental injustice where humans suffer as a result of that injustice, okay? First of all, you're doing something that is complicated and profound and difficult and important. But you're also doing something that has real consequences, and you're doing something which can easily lead you into speaking for that community, okay? And knowing more about the felt reality of their lives than they do, okay? And it's one of the key and difficult distinctions between entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. Others are, if you're doing this for profit, it's quite useful if you can capture markets. If you're doing something for profit, it's quite useful if you can put up barriers to entry to your competitors. Okay? If something is too easy to copy, okay, it's very hard to extract significant margin from it because it's too easy to copy. In this world, being easy to copy might, not necessarily is, but might be a very good thing. Okay? So it's one of those fundamental kind of pivots in the way you think about what you do, okay? Because the market logic would suggest, well, look, what's your comparative advantage? What's unique about what you're doing by virtue of what can only you do this? These are all good pieces of logic. But sometimes being copied in this world is a very good thing because it propagates a bunch of solutions. It allows you to get round some of the questions that people talk about when they talk about scale. So in shareholder entrepreneurship, scale is just another way, as it were, of increasing your turnover and your margin and your barriers to other people's entry. Okay. Here it may be that you want to do the exact reverse, which is make something as open and copyable and unprotected as possible. So I have taken nearly all my allotted time to give you a highly stylized sense of how to be a social entrepreneur. Okay? I haven't talked at all about whether to be a social entrepreneur, so I'm going to finish for just a minute or two with the whether question. Okay? It's pretty clear that we live in complicated, turbulent, connected, scary times. It's pretty clear that everywhere you look, there are the kinds of scary stuff that Roger Martin means when he talks about a terrible equilibrium. Okay? We know that there is energy insecurity or water insecurity or sanitation deficit or pandemic risk or climate change and so on. So on the one hand, there's a scary story about the world. Okay? On the other hand, we know that there is a vast amount of capital on the planet seeking risk-adjusted return, a significant chunk of which seeks that return in respect of improving the state of the world. Okay? It's hard to believe that second piece, okay, especially if you're trying to raise £50,000 to get something off the ground. But believe me, there is a ton of capital that wants to be deployed doing interesting things, okay, where the return is social or financial or both. Third fact about the world, we know a lot, and we're very well connected. And the kinds of things we know in bioengineering, in quantum computing, in the human sciences, the social sciences, natural sciences, humanities, absolutely astonishing, okay, more than we have known in the history of humankind. And this fourth piece is really important, there are people like you who care about the state of the world, who inherit the accelerating privilege of knowing each other and being in institutions like this and thinking hard about hard problems. That mix tells me that the question isn't simply how do you become a social entrepreneur or how do you become an entrepreneur. It's that you must, because most of the most interesting opportunities in your lifetime will sit in that complicated space where markets don't fully work, where the state can't be the only actor, where something is going wrong, where there is some kind of imperfect equilibrium between supply and demand, or between the apparent price and the real price, between positive consequences and negative consequences. That's where all the interesting stuff is going to happen. And that's where your energy, your creativity, someone else's money, someone else's technology, and the state of the world collide. And if you think that I exaggerate, imagine a world in which all you did was track the index of whichever thing you do. Okay? Imagine a world in which you said, look, I want to be a healthcare administrator. Okay? And let's go away with this entrepreneurship business. Okay? The likelihood of you surviving on that view in healthcare administration is close to zero in my view. Stuff will happen that disrupts your daily life. And that will be true whatever it is you want to do, whether it's politics, aid, charity, business, professional services. Everywhere you look will become a function of these highly complicated forces, which means that resilience in respect of the world, but also in respect of your own careers and lives and meaning, depends on you embracing some of these questions. That's my pitch. You know, the pitch is very simple, which is that you're all social entrepreneurs, and that social entrepreneurship, or some version of what we're talking about, is necessary, not elective. And what I want to do now is to introduce an old friend of mine, someone I've known from the year that that film we showed at the beginning was made, someone who gets stuff done without, where is he? I've lost him, there he is. Who gets stuff done without owning and controlling the means to get that stuff done, and someone who was absolutely motivated by a clear-sighted sense of an unjust, terrible equilibrium. Rupert's going to talk to us for 20 minutes about his journey, whether or not he accepts the label social entrepreneur. And we're then going to sit here and you can ask us questions. Start thinking now about the killer question. When you come to ask the question, tell us who you are, and try to frame your question as a question. Rupert.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and the slides I brought I barely want to use. I found that riveting, actually, and maybe I am a social entrepreneur, but I'm still agonizing over that. What I want to do is pick up where that film ended and give you a brief trot through where the Marine Stewardship Council has got to in terms of our vision of trying to ensure that the oceans remain resilient and productive, but also that we have seafood supplies safeguarded for this and future generations, because we're about ocean health, but we're also about livelihoods, and we're also about food security. I think another attribute of social entrepreneurship is to be an optimist. It seems like an enormous challenge. How do you fix the global fishing industry? And as that film showed, thank you, our global fisheries are in trouble. Sadly, the statistics are even worse than they were 10 years ago. Roughly, the UN estimate 30% of global stocks are overfished. The trends are going in the wrong direction. 50% are being fished as hard as they can be. Now, that's not necessarily bad. You can fish hard, you can fully exploit a fishery, but then when you look at population going from 7 billion to 9 billion to 11 billion people, growing demand for sustainable protein sources, growing middle classes in Asia, all tending to want to eat more fish, those fisheries will be put under more and more pressure. And then when you add in other challenges, which I hope some of you will become social entrepreneurs and resolve, acidification, plastics, climate change, all of these stresses are really adding to the challenges that our global fishing resources are facing. So to make this a little bit personal, I'm from a family of actors and musicians. No one finished school, no one went to university. I have no idea how I've ended up running the Marine Stewardship Council. I was the first to go to uni. I had no idea what to do because my parents were actors and musicians and they didn't have an idea either. So I just picked Sussex because a mate's girlfriend was there or something, and did a degree in economics, which was really interesting. And that got me into, you know, really focused on development and primary commodity terms of trade and all the social injustice. And that's sort of always been in the back of my mind. And the other big influence, I think, was being plunked in front of David Attenborough, my hero, at a very young age, watching the world about us and being inspired by the world about us. And, you know, I can articulate it now, but maybe subconsciously recognizing that, you know, we are interdependent. All life is indivisible, interdependent, interconnected, and this is one system. And we can all have an impact on that, depending on what we do. So I'm going to try and rattle through this. We've talked about the vision, oceans. The mission, I wish I had 2 hours or 3 hours, or even a whole day on this, actually. So I might get invited back if anybody's interested. But the mission is really boring. It's all about using our third-party certification and labeling program to influence the choices people make and to try and, you know, create a mechanism to reward good practice in the oceans, fisheries management, and incentivize change. It really is quite amazing, actually, you know, a standard setter, a third-party program based on science. It really, really can work. And MSC was founded by Unilever and WWF, so the world's largest international conservation organization. Unilever, at the time, they owned Gorton's in the States, Igloo throughout Europe, Birdseye in this country. And that Grand Banks cod fishery collapse was the wake-up call. And it's an amazing history. If you have time, get Cod, the biography of a fish that changed the world. Utterly amazing reading about the early explorers getting out there and literally dropping a bucket and loads of cod would come up, and the Basques were feeding Europe in the Middle Ages way before Columbus got to America. And it's just a story of how technology changed and how, you know, sail gave way to diesel and overfishing took place. And even now that fishery is pretty much closed. Theory of change. I wasn't really into Californian speak when I joined this organization. I came in 2004 as chief exec. And again, I think this maybe touches on elements of social entrepreneurship. The organization really was in a difficult situation. It had started with this fanfare of, you know, engaging with the industry and engaging with the market. And it was very obvious that with no supply, there was no market, and with no market, there was no supply. They'd also launched too soon. There was no consistency in the early certifications. So in their first 4 or 5 years, they only had about 5 or 6 fisheries and maybe 200 labeled products, and they had a heap of controversy, critical reports saying, oh, I've got to be careful actually because you're recording all of this, but let's just focus on it. They were going bust, they weren't seen as credible, and there was a feeling that they'd lost or they didn't have a license to operate in terms of their relationships. And actually I was working for Forum for the Future when I was approached to apply for this job, and Forum, probably Britain's leading sustainable development organisation with a very similar ethos, all about working on solutions, bringing stakeholders together to try and shift our economic systems from a fundamentally unsustainable, inequitable system to a more sustainable approach. And that's what appealed to me about the MSC, was working to get those incentives right, working to align, you know, disparate forces to sort of act as a broker to bring people together to sort of try and build consensus on what a sustainable fishery should look like, to do outreach, to educate, you know, the market to the crisis in the oceans, and to try and get them to say we want sustainable seafood. You know, and the MSC provides the mechanism for them to do that, get the assurance, and then hopefully, as the market increasingly says, we will only buy sustainable seafood that is traceable, you pull in the other fisheries, and that's where real change can be delivered. So I'm going to rattle through these because I assume everybody can have them afterwards if they want. So theory of change, lots of important stuff on why we're here. 70% of the planet, every second breath we take, 30% of the carbon all going into the oceans. Critical natural capital that if we don't sort of change course will have a profound impact in our lifetimes, let alone kids and their kids. So no time for a huge amount of detail, but standard developed, evolved considerably over the years, And the critical thing is it's applicable to all fisheries around the world. Small scale, large Alaskan fishing, mid-sized vessels in Norway. All of these images are taken from fisheries that have achieved MSC certification. Also, to be credible, we have to follow the United Nations rules and guidelines on what constitutes credible certification and labelling programs. And that means we have to be open to all fisheries, no matter what gear type, no matter what geography. We don't have a preconceived idea of what is sustainable and what isn't. It's up to the independent certifiers, not MSC. We're the standard holder, but 20 accredited certifiers around the world pull together 3 independent scientists. They look at the stock health, they look at the wider environmental impacts, they look at the quality of the management regime. Based on a very transparent, inclusive process, governments can get involved, Greenpeace, the industry. The fishery is scored, and if it meets the standard, it's certified. And it can't carry the label in the marketplace without full traceability. And this is super important, because if you go out and say, oh, I'm really concerned about the oceans, where's this fish come from? They'll go, oh, it's sustainable, or it's come from the sea. And without that traceability, there's a huge amount of fraud, mislabeling, species, country of origin, catch method. So we rely on that independent process with the full traceability. And the only exception, this is a great image of the Maldivian Poland line tuna fishery in the Indian Ocean. The only exception is explosives and poisons. It's hard to imagine you could have a fishery operating sustainably using dynamite or cyanide, which still carries on. I'm going to go through these really quickly because I want to draw out some of the things that Stefan's touched on. And I think, well, I'll draw out one of them now. It might come back in the questions. We don't get involved in a sort of ethical values dimension. We are a science-based program. Now, that worked when we started in the late 90s and as the program's grown. And this graph is showing you that just the phenomenal growth. So in fact, since that film was made, we've gone from 7% to 14% of the global harvest is now certified or currently going through certification. This is phenomenal. I hadn't quite worked this out, but I was with Fairtrade USA in Oakland, California a few weeks ago, and these guys were telling me that within fair trade, I think the most they've ever got to is 2 or 3% of a supply within any commodity group. And we're at 14%, and I'll come and talk on a little bit further about where we want to get to. But the issue I wanted to raise was there is controversy. This sort of makes it look really easy, but it is super difficult navigating different stakeholders who have very different views on what you need to do. So maybe another aspect of social entrepreneurship is the ability to listen. I think humility is critical. MSC isn't driving change. We provide a mechanism, and it's the leadership of our partners in the industry, the engagement of civil society, and the assessments. That's what's driving change. We just provide a mechanism that we continually refine to make it effective and efficient to scale. So the controversy, and we might come back to this, our program, not us, an independent certifier, has certified the Mexican tuna fishery. This is a fishery that sets its nets on dolphins. Sadly, very, very sadly, there is what we call a dolphin bycatch. Dolphins are killed in this fishery. So some in the NGO community feel this fishery should be shut down. It's killing marine mammals, and obviously no one wants to see dead dolphins. But this fishery has spent 25 years, way before it engaged with MSC, working on technology, innovation, to reduce that bycatch. In the mid-80s, 130,000 dolphins were being killed. Now it's about 700. And by engagement in the MSC program, they've set themselves a target of getting to 0. They're putting in $6 million that wouldn't go in otherwise for a comprehensive dolphin survey in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. And to show their good faith in really wanting to improve the environmental performance of their fleet, they've agreed to not catch bluefin in the South Pacific, which is an endangered species, but perfectly legal to catch. So our philosophy is you've got to work with them in the same way that we work with Walmart, and people were very critical, because that's how you deliver equilibrium change. That's how you deliver scale impact, and that's what we need to do. But it's a heap of controversy and a lot of disagreement, and that's just one example of many. But as we scale to the point that, as I said, 10 million tons of seafood, 14% of the landings, the expectations from different groups around the world on what we should or should not do grow, and it's really hard navigating that space.
How long have I got? Because I've barely started, have I?
You've got 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, great, I'll keep going. So, tipping points. We're there in terms of some of the supply. 14% of global landings, but over half of the groundfish are MSC certified. You know, you can read the statistics there. Two sides of the same coin. We're trying to engage the global fishing industry, educate them, bring them into this voluntary program, drive change where needed. And the other side of the coin is to try and create, operationalize a sort of sustainable consumption model, to try and get the market to say we care deeply and passionately about this issue, and we're going to preference sustainable seafood to draw these fisheries in and incentivize those change. I can't get over the growth, actually. It's why my team is so exhausted all the time, because it is just amazing, the growth. I mean, the market's gone from those couple of hundred products to a market now worth $6 billion, over 27,000 individual MSC labeled products available in 100 countries around the world. I think we said 30, I think, in the film. And what's really interesting is we started, you know, in Northern Europe. We're a very small organisation. When I got to MSC in about 2004, just gone through this period of contraction from about 25 people down to 12. And there was virtually no labelled product out there, because the market kept saying, well, if there's no supply, we can't put the label on the humble Thames herring, which was one of our first fisheries, or this dodgy sounding fish called hoki from New Zealand that no one's ever heard of. But we got a major breakthrough in Alaska pollock. 1.5 million tonnes at the time became certified, and the market took off. But even then, people said, it's Northern European, maybe North America, it's never going to work in Asia. And you look at some of these slides of the market. I've just come back from Japan. I was there the week before last. Aeon, Japan's largest retailer. We saw them, again, actually, probably about 10 years ago. And they've really got behind the program, and they've set themselves a 20% target of all of their seafood being certified either to MSC, where Wild Capture, or our sister organisation, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, farmed. That's huge, and it's profound, because back to leveraging other people's resources, they are educating their consumers, and they have stores in China and elsewhere in Asia. And we've got to the point now, and we are a not-for-profit organisation. We have a very sustainable business model that if we have time, I'm happy to talk about. But we are definitely leveraging other people's resources to raise awareness and keep this engine of growth going. Not because we just want to grow the program for the hell of it, but because we need that engine. We need to scale to bring those fisheries in and drive change. So Les Yeux Bleus, Carrefour, the world's biggest food retailer, they're bigger than Walmart in food. They every year have these, you know, amazing campaigns throughout France in their hypermarkets, and all the brands come together in a sort of non-competitive way to educate about sustainable seafood. Game changers, Walmart, that was in the film. McDonald's, it took 10 years of discussion, and you know, you can't buy a fillet of fish now throughout Europe, North America, Canada, and Brazil that doesn't carry the MSC label. And there is fantastic stories we don't have time to get into how that decision drove change in the Baltic Sea, where they were sourcing from a cod fishery that had marine mammal interactions, it had pirate fishing going on. But by corralling all these disparate actors, that fishery fixed its problems. The Danes put pressure on the Polish government because there was some issues with some Polish pirate fishing. Why? Because they had 2,000 jobs dependent on this fishery in the Baltic. They wanted to keep the contract with McDonald's. And that's where you harness market forces to drive positive change. Supply chain pressure of the best kind. Rapidly, we're moving from retail to food service. This is the Hilton in Singapore. Unbelievable. You'll see the MSC label on all of their restaurants, on the menus. And most interestingly, their staff are just super energized about this. And it's very interesting, as you probably know, hospitality is very mobile, and a lot of their chefs are German, they're Dutch, they're American, and they're all really smart. So if they can't buy an MSC certified fish, they just go online, find who's supplying it, and they're bringing it in. Huge difference. The consumers are beginning to recognize the label. IKEA, they're the biggest, I think, food service company in the world. 100% MSC throughout the world now. So Olympics, London Olympics were MSC, Rio Olympics had some MSC, and my trip to Tokyo was about the Tokyo Olympics. We want to move from business to business to consumer, and that's a large part of our future strategy, is leveraging other people's resources to help us get there. I am going to quickly show you just one video clip. That's just the growth of products. We've sort of gone through that. Chain of custody, 40,000 businesses now with chain of custody around the world. I'm going to pause to show you this film. Now.
This is pollock, and this is pollock, but they're totally different. One is pollock South Dakota, and the other is real wild-caught Alaska pollock from a certified sustainable fishery. And that's the pollock you'll find in the McDonald's Filet of Fish. So, no matter where you are, you can always get real fish caught sustainably from here. So let's review. This is that one place called pollock, this is real wild-caught Alaska pollock, and this is who can bring it all together, sourced from a sustainable fishery. And it's delicious.
We didn't pay a penny for that, and you know, that's prime time throughout the States. Maybe reflecting, you know, sort of cultural differences between the US and Europe. This is.
There you go. You'll need these. Thanks. You coming? Yeah. Come and jump on, Chris. So where are we going then?
We're going out to the mussel lines and, yeah, hopefully you can see what it's all about.
As long as I don't end up in the water, I'll be fine.
OK, Michael. This is it. This is where the mussels live.
So you don't dredge these?
No, it's ropes that the mussels grow on. They just thrive in these kind of conditions. This is A-grade water, which is
the best.
Which is the best, yeah.
They hold on quite well, don't they?
Yeah, they've got a good grip.
Tell me about sustainability.
We've been farming here for nearly 30 years, and if it isn't sustainable, we wouldn't be in business. OK, we'll cook some mussels up. Here we are.
Oh, wow. Thank you. But these are so good. No mud, no grit.
Nope.
So, Chris, it's not a bad ditch.
I'm sorry about the ditch.
Yeah.
I kind of wasn't expecting it to be quite like this. It's definitely not a ditch.
So the reason I wanted to show you that, let me just close that down again, is when I started, you know, we couldn't even get through the door of retailers, and we couldn't barely get them to put the label on. Now they're spending significant resources and building MSC sustainability into their messaging, which will help hopefully accelerate and enable us to expand what we're doing. Now I just need to find my slides. I'm going to rattle through. There's a couple of slides left. We've talked about supply chain. What I want to do is just remind everybody, this isn't about numbers of fisheries, tons of fisheries, or labelled products. That's just a means to an end. It's a sort of metric to get a sense of scale. What really matters is change on the water. And you know, as a non-profit, you know, when I started, 100% of our income was foundation generated. We're now 80% self-generating through the use of the label. We still get philanthropic support, but the most important thing for all of our stakeholders is demonstrating impact. And I think we're about the only organisation in the marine conservation space that's committed to producing an annual global impacts report where we talk about change on the water. This example is just brilliant, and it comes back to the issue of conflict and being able to deal with criticism and disagreements. South Africa hake entered into MSC assessment. Huge pushback from some of the NGOs. It's not sustainable, it's a big industrial fishery, and we had to say it's not certified, it's just entered into this very transparent process where you can bring all of these issues and concerns to the certifiers and they can look at the evidence and make their decision. Turned out there were massive issues. There wasn't one stock of hake, there was two. One was overfished, they were killing over 10,000 seabirds, huge number of wandering albatross. You know, there's some real issues. But instead of walking away and just letting that fishery carrying on, which is what would have happened, MSC created this sort of brokerage of bringing the government, the regulator, local NGOs, WWF. They worked with the fishery. The industry wanted to improve. Both stocks now operating sustainably. Bird bycatch reduced by 95%. And then importantly, the industry did independent economic analysis that said without MSC, you know, $187 million of export markets would be at risk. 12,000, I think, really needed processing jobs. You know, very much needed in you know, coastal communities would be in jeopardy. And so there was some analysis saying the net present value of the fishery would be about 35% lower in 5 years than it would otherwise have been without the certification. So it's a great, to me, personification of livelihoods, you know, markets, business case, and ecological case. I think well, okay, sustainable development goals, we don't really have time to talk about them, but it's why I'm an optimist. I do think we can fix global fisheries. I really do. We now have a framework, SDG 14, all about restoring oceans, ensuring fisheries are managed sustainably. Governments have signed up to it. I think MSC's had 20 years of trying to do it, so we're trying to tap into this as an enabler. Our strategy, you might be able to see that very clearly. So much I've not been able to tell you about, but we've got better at doing what we've been doing. We've built a phenomenal stakeholder engagement, in over 100 countries. I'd say we're international, we're not global. There's parts of the world we're not operating in. And therefore, unashamedly, we want to scale. We want to go to 20% by 2020. And we've set an aspirational goal. I was fortunate enough to be invited to talk at the UN in June at their inaugural Oceans Conference. And I said, we're going to go for over a third of global landings by 2030. Why? Because there's an urgency and there is a crisis. And if we are not ambitious, we won't deliver it. But I used that opportunity to say we cannot do it on our own. We're a voluntary program. We're not an alternative to public policy. We're a complement. We need you governments to set the right enabling environment. And for my fishy world, that means detailed stuff on harvest control rules, how you manage the oceans. But it also means strategic engagement from the market, not just a tiny bit of, we'll buy a bit of sustainable fish. It really means you've got to do this. Send those signals and be consistent and understand that fisheries can be certified and they can lose their assessments. It's not a guarantee forever. So I know I'm pretty much out of time. I won't talk about governance, but this is my last slide to show the power of the market. I thought this was a spoof. Jolly bald Dutch astronaut floating around in the International Space Station. This is for real. We didn't set him up to this. He did it himself. And here we have, in zero gravity, a can of wild Alaskan MSC certified salmon floating around. And you can read what he's saying. And there's the blue planet outside the window. The power of the market, if you get those incentives right, if you can connect producers with consumers and ultimately make it an end consumer issue, I think you can drive real change. So we're going to carry on fixing fishing, but I'm really hoping that some of you will become entrepreneurs and fix acidification, plastics, and climate. Thank you. Sorry if I overran.
Come and take a seat.
Which one do you want?
You choose.
Okay.
Okay, first, thank you very much. Second, start honing the perfect questions. So just to ease us into this, I'm going to start with a question that I would have been honing had I been sitting down there, which is this dolphin bycatch question, okay, that you described as being quite controversial. How do you know, as a person and as someone who runs a very large and I think very important organization, how do you know when a firm stand becomes a slippery slope?
Okay, elaborate a little bit further. A firm stand.
How do you check with yourself that, that the dolphin bycatch is okay at this level, but it wouldn't be at this level, or where the dolphin bycatch is okay, but something else that is, as it were, at the margins isn't? Because what's clear about your organization is how strongly you've stuck with the mission.
Yeah. So, MSC is the standard setter, standard based on the United Nations Food and Agricultural Code of Conduct for Responsible Fishing. There's a whole heap of science about stock health, environmental impacts, quality of management regime. MSC doesn't certify anything, the independent certifiers do. We've evolved to a system that requires huge transparency, disclosure of evidence, independent auditors taken on board to do those assessments, and they have to look at, in the case of the dolphins, the evidence base to show that that mortality and bycatch of dolphins is not impacting on the recovery, functioning integrity of that dolphin population. A strength of the MSC program is the fact that whilst the fishery certificate lasts 5 years, every year there's a surveillance audit to make sure that fishery still meets the standard. In addition, there's an action plan to require continuous improvement, and in the case of the dolphins, that's why they're putting $6 million in for the most comprehensive survey of dolphins in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, and why they have, why they continue to invest heavily in the development of new gear to make sure dolphins can escape. Now, the reality is, any dead dolphin is obviously regrettable. These are highly intelligent animals, and nobody wants to see that. But back to this issue of trade-offs, The science, determined by others, is that actually this level of mortality is sustainable. There are 2.5 million plus dolphins in the eastern tropical Pacific. This is a bycatch of about 700. They will be being killed and eaten by killer whales. There'll be natural predation from other sources, disease, mortality. It's a relatively low number, but it is such a tough issue. That's why the industry is trying to take it down to zero. So the assurance and confidence comes from the fact that the hood is lifted up over the bonnet, everybody can look in, all of the evidence has to be there, and it has to be publicly scrutinised. And every 5 years, our standard gets harder as it incorporates new science. And that's the beauty of getting fisheries in the programme. They continually improve as understanding improves. Sorry, a bit verbose, it'd be quite hard to...
I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, the first hand up was at the back there. Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm in the Human Rights Programme here. And my question relates to that. So obviously the commercial fishing industry is one of the most dangerous industries in the world in terms of human rights abuses, and it has recently gotten a lot of criticism. So with other standards such as the SA 8000 standard or ISO out there, how do you play your part as a human rights standard as well as an accreditation of the standard of the product?
Absolutely great question, and so real time. So when we started, the issue was collapsing fish stocks and the biomass. It was all about ecological sustainability, and we've stuck true to that because it is exceptionally difficult just to get the science right on fisheries. But this is a dilemma that we're facing at the moment. The German market in particular is saying sustainability, consumers understand this, and it's not just ecological, it's social, and it's economic. And there are huge abuses, going on that are quite widespread, within the global fishing industry. They've come to light, and it's an issue that the industry is trying to tackle, slave and bonded labour. MSC is not set up to do that, and actually, in all honesty, there is no solution at the moment for auditing and verifying social issues at sea with vessels. And some of these vessels can be out at sea for a long time, particularly when there's transshipment. But what we are doing through I didn't touch on the governance, but we have a multi-stakeholder board, we have an advisory council, and we are looking at bringing social criteria in as early as 2018. So it's the beginnings of developing social criteria that will be audited. We're going to require all fishery clients to report what measures, policies and procedures they have in place to ensure that their supply chains are free of the most egregious aspects of slave and bonded labour. But I think that will evolve over time. And for the supply chain, on a risk-based basis, we will probably require third-party audits from 2018 to some of the standards that you've actually mentioned, because this is the way the world's going. But it's a huge challenge because we're focused on ecological sustainability. Some stakeholders are saying, you've got to do social. Some are saying, just deal with the worst aspects or provide some assurance. Some of the social auditors are saying, don't do that, that's our space, we don't want you to do it. Some parts of the industry are saying, do it, we've got nothing to hide, we're really proud of it. And other parts of the industry are saying, if you do that, we're leaving your program. And that's just one of the many examples of complexity and the challenge of keeping everybody in the tent to try and stay core to our mission as well.
Next hand was, let me go right there, yeah.
So I'm Maddie from the Masters of Public Administration. Thanks for a great talk. I just had a question, or I'd be interested in your observations about the extent to which the change we've seen in the MSC space is driven by consumer tastes changing, or to what extent it's driven by businesses sort of, I suppose, developing a moral conscience independently of that. Like, it's obviously a market force, what we're, with the advertisements, it's a way of marketing your products. But I'm just curious about the extent to which you think it is really just about businesses wanting an edge in the market when it comes to marketing their products. I guess related to that is, I'd be interested in how you approach businesses and what you appeal to, whether you appeal to their market instincts or whether you appeal to, I suppose, different different things and what businesses respond to?
Got it.
Okay, it varies depending on the market. So early years, yes, our outreach was to just educate about challenges in the ocean and overfishing, and undoubtedly some early adopters were looking for differentiation in the market, an edge, you know, premium on a green product. We didn't even talk about price premiums, that's a whole separate conversation. But I would say, having this is my 14th year at MSC, I think most people I talk to are getting into this for strategic reasons and also because they're human beings. And if you do educate people and explain that they can be part of the solution, or they can carry on, you know, indiscriminately choosing seafood with no idea of where it's come from and perhaps, you know, continue to lead to the depletion of oceans, they want to do the right thing. So I think it's become, for many, particularly in Northern Europe, business strategy. In Japan, undoubtedly, Aeon, they said our consumers have no idea. They've never heard of your label. We're going to educate them and we're going to bring this in and it's going to be significant volumes. That's working. We're taking off in China, which is something somebody said would never happen. Alibaba, their online trading platform, Tmall, set a 20% target. It's quite remarkable. And their competitor, JD.com's done the same. Your point about consumers, though, is to begin with, it was choice editing. It was what goes in the cabinets in the supermarkets. So it was the buyers that were really driving this. So, you know, strategy, initially maybe an edge, maybe a price premium. But, you know, the investors are getting into this now. There's some cases, studies showing, you know, lower risk. If you're lending money to a seafood business, good to know if they're sourcing from sustainable sources, and hopefully their income will be able to pay back whatever it is into the future. So there's evidence of lower cost of capital, lower risk. And what our future strategy is going to be about is really bridging to get to be a consumer entity. And that's happening organically in some markets like Germany, where there's a 60% logo recognition, and every retailer carries the label. So the pressure we're under there is, hang on, there is no differentiation. We've all got it. You've got to keep adding to the value proposition. And that's super difficult as well, because we can't grow indefinitely. So hard to be succinct, sorry. I'll try.
There was a hand up at the back, yeah, right there.
To be honest, I was actually going to ask pretty much exactly the same question.
Okay.
So.
The next hand is there, right by the camera with the kind of stripe there.
Thank you. My name is Antonio from the Social Innovation Entrepreneurship Program. My question is more, you talked about this, you mentioned it very briefly. In international and global standardization like you're doing, like one of the ultimate social impacts you could have is the influence of social policy and legislation at a local level. In your opinion and your experience, how much are you able as a standard program to be able to define and help countries define a legal framework of sustainable practices? In this particular case, it would be marine, but in general, do you think that that's something that you could be doing?
Again, it's another great question because, you know, MSC was founded because of the failure of global governance to manage our ocean resources. So in the early years, there was skepticism, is putting it politely. There was some hostility from certain countries that, you know, MSC was trying to influence and you know, undermine their sovereign right to manage their own fishery resources. And that's changed. 20 years on, I think governments recognize that a sort of voluntary program like the MSC is a complement to delivering the public policy goals that they want to see. But also, we've got 20 years of experience. We've got huge amounts of data on what constitutes sustainable fishing. So another part of our strategy I wasn't able to touch on very much was our determination to engage in the global south more effectively. We want to double the number of small-scale developing world fisheries. There's 28 at the moment. We want to double that in the next 3 years or 2.5 years. And one of the reasons I was in California is I wanted to see if we can, and this again, social entrepreneurship, think big. As Stefan said, there's huge amounts of money out there, and we're all sort of, you know, we operate within thinking that's a lot of money, we'll ask for even more. I'd like to get 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 million into a fund, a global sustainable fisheries fund, to help pay for capacity building and to maybe overcome some of the obstacles smaller scale fisheries have to get them on a pathway to MSC. So they're way off from a market and a label, but we could, if we could use our convening power, if we could demonstrate with 20 years track record, we're a good bet to, you know, invest in, whether it's philanthropy or impact investing, all to be worked out. But we're looking at that. So in a way, we're beginning to get a little bit more involved in quite public policy advocacy as well. There's a role.
By the way, that reminds me, of course, of building measurement into the process from the start rather than after the fact.
Yeah.
Okay, next question, right here at the front.
Hi, I'm Mauro from the Masters in Public Administration program, and my question is very brief. What did you do to get your first client to put your label on the product that maybe other organizations could use as well?
Good question.
Good question. It predates me. I came in 2004 and the organization launched in 99. I think Unilever, as our co-founder, had a huge influence here. So they've divested all of their fish business now. The biggest purchaser of frozen fish, and consequently I think they put a bit of supply chain pressure to their customers to begin to use the label, and also on their source fisheries, and that's what enabled the MSC to overcome that no supply, no market, no supply. And in fact they were sourcing from the Alaska pollock fishery, and that coincidentally got certified about 6 months after I joined, but it had been a longer process. So some leaders, I think, you can get people who say this is the right thing to do. Yes, it's an embryonic program, but I believe in it. So there was an element of that. There was also the fact, we started in London. We had relations with some of the major UK retailers here, who basically just helped get things going.
Alan Schwartz, I'm a visitor from Melbourne, Australia. Firstly, congratulations, fantastic achievement. You want to go from 14 to 30%. I'm interested in the macro. What happens to the other 70%? Is it other certifiers, or is it always going to be some people are going to be able to capture a different market and create havoc, if you like, with a balance of the stock, so that the good, if you like, who get the certification, who serve the markets that care, suffer, if you like, and it becomes an unsustainable macro outcome for global fisheries. If I could just restate that, if every fisherman had a sustainable certificate, then we would have a sustainable ocean. But I don't think that's going to happen without some sort of a regulatory framework, or am I wrong?
Again, great question. And so to be absolutely crystal clear, what MSC wants, and I think what majority of, in fact, probably all of the organisations in the marine conservation space want, and the industry, is sustainable oceans. We want the entirety of the fishing industry around the world, no matter what scale, no matter what ocean, to operate at a sustainable level. We're not saying they have to be MSC certified. We're just saying, wouldn't it be great if they operated at a recognised standard for sustainable performance? So the long-term objective is 100% sustainability, no need for MSC, fantastic, game over, move on to the next challenge. The 30% is really just a metric on moving towards that 100%. And what we need to do is evolve and innovate and find other tools and methods to bring less performing fisheries in and help them on their journey, create funds to fund some of that transition, and hopefully influence public policy. And there's a great story of the Indian Ocean skipjack fishery was going to lose its certificate. One of the conditions that was put on that certificate was the RMFO, Regional Management Fishing Organisation, needed to implement harvest control rules, which are predefined rules for when the stock drops. They know what they're going to do in terms of allocating catch to all the different countries catching on that stock. Now, the fishery had met our standard because the stock was super healthy, but they didn't have these well-defined rules. So that 5-year requirement saw the Maldives with UK retailers and NGOs coming together, not necessarily supportive of MSC per se, but supportive of better fisheries management, all beginning to put a little bit of pressure on the commissioners of the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. And lo and behold, it never happened in the history of RMFOs that they implemented a harvest control rule for a healthy stock. So that's an example of a voluntary market-based program. I think having an influence is ultimately down to the leadership of the IOTC and the various people involved. But I have no doubt MSC and the desire to keep certification was one of those drivers. So whether it's 30%, 50%, 10%, we want to try and take all of that learning and help create that enabling environment and help others to create it. So again, I haven't probably answered your question. Tiered standard is another innovation we're thinking about.
Okay, so we've got quite a lot of hands up, and I want to try to hear from as many of you as possible. So rather than doing this serially, what I'm going to ask you in red t-shirts to do is those of you with your hands up, keep your hands up, so that you in red t-shirts can spot these people. And we're going to go as quickly as we possibly can, right? So this really is a question is a question. We're going to get all of you to give your question, and then Rupert will decide which ones he wants to answer, and I'll make him answer the ones he doesn't want to answer. Okay? So go, quick.
Yeah, I'm Dylan. To follow up to that is, how do you educate the average consumer to look for certified products that might be more expensive because they care about this instead of just looking at what's the most affordable?
Got it. Next one.
My question pertains to, I guess, the downsides of social entrepreneurship, because we're dealing with such difficult market failures and spillovers and externalities. What if you, despite your best intentions, make the whole situation or part of the situation worse off? How do you deal with that?
My question is, with developed countries wasting about 50% of all of the food that's produced and developing countries wasting about 30%, do you have anything in place to account for that when you decide whether a fishery is sustainable or not?
My question was about, sort of to both of you, about could you speak more generally about resilience and how do you build your team either individually or kind of more across the board, especially for something like ocean management, which is such a big systemic issue?
Yeah.
Hi, my question is about, is MSC looking at moving from a platform kind of a business to a pipeline kind of a business as well in the future, like probably apart from providing certification, move to having own fisheries, probably give more credibility. Thank you.
Hello. My question is about whether you face any competition from other sorts of certification. Also, whether these are initiatives perhaps from big retailers or people from the industry with lower standards, and whether certain inflation of certification is occurring on this matter.
Great. Okay. There's one next to you right there. And then there's two at the back. Yeah.
Hi. My question is, how has the success of MSC affected the fisheries who may have wanted the certification but couldn't afford it and so are still excluded from the benefits of the certification?
Yeah.
My question is, you mentioned that you worked with fisheries in Japan, and I was wondering if you worked with any fisheries in Taiji, and if there's any shift in their attitudes towards dolphins and any shift in the policies of the government towards dolphins.
Okay, and then the very last question.
Does it taste better than non-sustainably sourced fish?
You bet. Okay, so unless anyone feels that they have something that they desperately want to ask, yes, one person.
Coming from policy and working for government, how would you say that governments can create or advise or support in creating a good environment for MSC and for fisheries?
Great. So that's a very broad range of questions. Do you want to pick them off as they occur to you, and I will keep a tally and remind you of anything that is particularly difficult that I'll then drop on you.
Great, okay, I'll do it. It's so annoying when you need glasses for distance, but then they get in the way of writing. So I'm not sure I got all of those. Education, consumers. Firstly, McDonald's, Walmart, Lidl, they've made it abundantly clear. They will sell MSC certified fish at the same price as non-certified fish. There is no price premium. We have, you go into Sainsbury's or Tesco's, right through their value range or best value, whatever they call it. You've got MSC seafood at different price points. So it isn't an elitist, super expensive, no one can afford it. It's down to the basics. Educating consumers, it's a core part of our next 3-year strategy. For us, we're sinking a chunk of money in it, but to do co-marketing along the lines that I showed with those films, I think it could take off very, very quickly, especially in Northern Europe. Could we make matters worse? I don't think so. I think the whole engagement with the MSC program leads to wider improvements beyond the fishery, and I've talked about public policy reform and just improved management that might not lead to certification. So maybe I'm missing something on that question, but I think we're a force for good. Food waste, really, really good question. And that's a tough one again. It's touching on the values and the ethics. We have fisheries that have bycatch, and we have some fisheries where that bycatch, and it's a shark, it's a swordfish fishery, and it catches blue sharks. Some of these fisheries have long, long lines, you know, a mile of lines and hooks, and there's a significant bycatch of shark. Now, again, no one wants to see that. The fishers definitely don't want to see it, because for every hook with a shark on it is a hook without a swordfish on it. So what do we do where that bycatch of shark is bigger than the swordfish? Does that feel right? And this is another challenge of the moment that we're wrestling with. The good thing is with that fishery in the programme, they are obliged under the latest iteration of our standard to make sure that they take that bycatch down further beyond the science. At the moment, it's got its certificate because the blue shark population is very, very healthy, and that bycatch is not impacting on its health. And when I talk to the really serious scientists, they go, well, you know, it's also providing food for other marine animals, and you know, it's all within the ecosystem. But it's a very good, tough question. I think it was a question on resilience and the team. Yeah. I won't joke, it's really hard work. When I joined MSC, it was 70-hour weeks, and it feels like it's been like that ever since. We've had near survival episodes. You know, I was down to, you get 30 grand through the door or you fire someone, and we did a lot of that. I think there is something exciting about working for a mission, values-driven organisation. You know, my staff's gone from the 12 I had to 200. We've got 20 offices around the world. We're super international, 60% female. My German team is nine women, driving amazing success in the German market. But we have to make tough calls. And I think actually it's very important when you're in a management or leadership position, you've got a vision, and you have to let people go. And sometimes you have to restructure. And my experience of some NGOs is they don't make those calls, and therefore you haven't got the best people doing the most effective, efficient, mission-driven work at the time. So there's a piece there, but I think a value that we have is fun. We work hard, but it's just great, you know, to spend time together. Competition, great question. There is competition, and I'm really glad there is, because, you know, to begin with, MSC, you know, we don't like you, we're founded by WWF, you're just like Greenpeace, you're trying to stop us fishing. We've had to overcome that, and it's taken 20 years to say, actually, we're a science-based standard and we're very independent. And in fact, WWF, you know, they're a great supporter, but they're also a great critic as well, and they object to a number of certifications. We have an objections process we didn't get into. Industry has developed some alternative schemes, and they are getting better, and that is to be welcomed. You know, back to Stefan's point about if it's easy to copy, maybe you can scale quicker. And maybe if there were, you know, other schemes that could deal with the, you know, the better performing fisheries, as long as they were credible and robust, and as long as they were driving change, we could evolve and maybe find other ways of addressing the developing world. So competition is good, but interestingly, it's not, you know, we don't really feel it in the marketplace at the moment. If you go anywhere in Europe, North America, you know, you'll basically see the MSC label in the cabinets. You won't see many others. In the wild capture, aquaculture is a bit different. Access, yeah, it's a high bar, pass-fail certification and labelling program. So it is much, much harder for developing world fisheries who haven't got the sophisticated management, they haven't got the data sets to get certified. But we're operating a global standard. And this is one of the tensions we have with some of the NGOs who really want us to keep raising the bar. Zero bycatch, you know, far greater levels of precaution on benthic impacts or whatever else it might be. But the more we raise the drawbridge, the harder it gets for these fisheries. And we want to engage the global industry and drive change at scale. And there's that constant tension that is really, really difficult to deal with. And it involves an awful lot of discussion and debate and hopefully consensus building. But we don't always get there, which is why, you know, if you Google MSC, you'll see a shed load of criticism and some of the challenges I've barely scraped the surface on. Government policy, maybe I've already covered that one.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the question you missed was, does it taste better?
Without doubt, no. I mean, Does it taste better? I do the cooking and the shopping, and my kids can tell the difference between a mackerel, a herring, and a salmon. I think it does taste better, knowing it's from a sustainable source, but that's just me.
You're going to tell me we missed one. Dolphins in Japan.
Dolphins in Japan, yeah, I knew there was. I wrote dolphins and I couldn't remember what else. MSC has to be, we are a not-for-profit using a voluntary market-based program. We're not Greenpeace. We're not, advocates for change, at least overtly. And that is such a difficult issue, and it touches on cultural values as well, that it's not a space we're getting into. Our place in the world is to bring as many fisheries into a transparent, evidence-based process. And then when, if impacts are beyond ecological limits, they have to be reduced. And that's how we drive change. Now, it's one reason why we've struggled with the social dimension. When MSC started, we had 4 principles were under development: health as a stock, wide environmental impacts, quality of the management regime, and social performance. This was in the mid-90s when Leading Lights were developing the original standard. And they gave up on the social because there is no globally accepted social standard. What might be regarded as acceptable for a Korean boat or a Taiwanese boat might be different to an Alaskan boat or a Norwegian boat or a Ghanaian boat. And so it's a minefield, and we've got to keep our license to operate and ability to operate in countries within the constraints of what we're doing.
Brilliant. That is a great answer to a very good question. Rupert and I have known each other for about 10 years, and we've disagreed for every one of those 10 years about whether he is or he isn't a social entrepreneur. But let me try one last time to persuade him. He uses other people's resources to get something done where that thing is profoundly mission-based. The focus on the mission, which is the eradication of this unjust equilibrium, has been constant. And he operates at a level of ambition about changing things at a system level. And he's very quick to shift and pivot and adapt and learn, but never to flip. Now, if I'm right that those are characteristics of a social entrepreneur, then I'm sorry. At least for the purpose, since I now have the chair, you are a social entrepreneur. Thank you. And I'm just going to check who in the room, we took a little poll right at the beginning, who in the room thinks that either as a result of hearing Rupert and being inspired, or because they've just slightly recalibrated their own sense of themselves, that they might be or might have the desire or capacity to be a social entrepreneur now? Okay, so I'm absolutely delighted that is a much bigger number than it was at the beginning. So thank you, although maybe you're just being polite. So all I have to do now is the nice stuff, which is to thank you for coming to the Marshall Institute, coming to the LSE, giving us this really fascinating insight into how you build something that is big and significant and how you stay true to that mission. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for asking really smart questions, for doing us the courtesy of framing them as questions, and for being here at all. This is not part of your assessment, this is not part of your degrees, and although I modestly think that we have an amazing program for you, what I really want to leave you with is the notion that this isn't the exchange of content or knowledge, this is a movement. And if you're here, you're at least potentially part of this movement. My view, for what it's worth, is this is the fastest growing social movement on the planet. Okay? People who think that the world could be better and people who think that the kind of market mechanisms that we've been hearing about might help that is the biggest movement, social movement on the planet. And I would love it if you became part of that movement and your entry to the movement was through this series. So I will see you next Tuesday in this very room. Thank you.
Thank you.